Welcome back. Professor Jeffrey Sachs joins us today to discuss, seemingly the unraveling of the world. So thank you very much for coming back on.
These are dramatic moments, no question about it. Absolutely unbelievable.
Well, we are seeing now, though, that we've entered the second week of the war against Iran, and it's the regime change operation is not going as planned, obviously. What do you see being the strategy of the United States now that they failed in the initial objective?
Strategy is a big word when it comes to Donald Trump. I don't think there is a strategy. We don't really know. And of course, at wartime, we will not be told what is going on behind the scenes, but what we can gather is a tremendous amount of confusion. A confusion about expectations of what would happen, a confusion about war aims, a confusion about the real situation on the ground. So fog of war is the usual simile. I think we are absolutely befogged right now when it comes to Washington. The only public outlet we have is Donald Trump's posts on Truth Social. These are the ravings of a madman. And this is also part of what we are experiencing. We have a war with great danger and complexity, and we have a president that is in my view, mentally unhinged.
Well, I've repeatedly warned that, the illusion of escalation control is what could take us to a third world war, because this war is spreading fast and it's very much out of control. Indeed, it's not just a war in Iran. We see, of course, Iran taking credit for hitting U.S. bases in several countries, yet it also denies the attack on Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, which doesn't seem to make much sense, and could be, of course, the U.S. and Israel attempting to pull in proxies. Well, we don't know, but we do know that the U.S. is arming and pulling Kurdish fighters as a proxy into the war, and there's now arguments that Russia is giving Iran intelligence, which I'm not sure is true, but it seems likely as the U.S. gives Ukraine intelligence. And also, after the decapitation strikes on Iran, there is immense pressure on Moscow now to restore its deterrence from further NATO attacks, while the Europeans talk about more nuclear weapons in quantity and spreading it around. Are we already moving into a World War III here?
We are probably in the early days of World War III, and the question will be whether it is contained. But we're already in a global war because there's a war in the Western Hemisphere underway. And even as the attention is on Iran, Trump is signaling in his not so subtle way that the U.S. will take Cuba. This could very well happen. The war in Ukraine, of course, continues. The war in the Middle East is now across the Middle East. The war between Pakistan and Afghanistan is perhaps somehow related to this. Iranian vessels, an Iranian naval vessel was sunk off the coast of India. And for all of these reasons, fighting is across the world. The fighting is at least loosely linked. We don't know how closely linked it is. Part of American strategy seems to be to try to corner and control the energy markets. This is not playing too well because the energy supplies are being blown up by the hour. And so we're entering also a worldwide energy crisis that is likely to be extremely serious. And as they say, it's not yet been priced into the markets. This is the usual way that cataclysmic global events are turned into financial jargon. But the point is we're going to enter a an energy crisis that is extraordinarily severe as well. This will hurt Europe considerably. It will threaten Asian countries deeply. It will probably mean spreading war. So there's no doubt, by the way, or I shouldn't say no doubt. I'd be shocked, absolutely, if Russia and China were not supporting Iran. Why wouldn't they? They have a strategic relationship with Iran. China depends on Iran for oil. The United States is basically at war with China. And much of what the United States is doing is really aimed at China. For example, cutting off Venezuelan oil supplies to China, now aiming to cut off Russian oil supplies to China, though the waiver was just lifted because of the chaos, aiming to cut off Iranian supplies to China. So if China isn't supporting Iran, something's wrong with all our textbooks, that's for sure. If China were to stand by and let the U.S. take over the world, that would be quite strange.
Yeah, this efforts to take over the world energy markets, it's very blatant. I mean, I just watched a clip on Fox News where they have an interview going, well, yes, any price we're paying in this war will be outweighed by the massive benefits once we get control over Iran's oil as well. And it made me think about the article you wrote recently about arguing that the US-Israeli attack on Iran is also an attack on the United Nations. And indeed, well, international law obviously has been violated in the past, but now there doesn't even seem to be a pretense to abide by it. Indeed, there seems to be a pride in it. For example, Hegseth, he dismisses the rule of engagement as being politically correct and weak. So there seems to be almost direct efforts to dismantle international law, as you know, the Board of Peace more or less makes this clear. I was wondering if you can flesh out that argument.
Well, the U.S. government under Trump, but I would say more generally, but still to a dramatic extent under Trump, despises the UN, wants to kill it, is aiming to kill it both through 1,000 cuts and through a devastating blow. If you believe that you are the world's hegemon, as Emperor Donald believes, then anything that tries in Lilliputian ways to hold you down is pathetic. So they want to smash the United Nations. And they've been absolutely clear about it. Earlier this year, the United States walked out of more than 30 UN agencies. The U.S. has repudiated fundamental UN treaties and objectives. We've had an end of the nuclear arms control agreements, which were part of the UN system. The U.S. doesn't pay its bills to the United Nations. The U.S. doesn't respect the institutions of the United Nations. And it's clear, at least Trump and this U.S. government, and I would say the CIA and the deep state more generally, aim for global hegemony, and the UN is the opposite of that. Well, maybe not quite the opposite of it, but it's co-responsibility with other countries, and the U.S. does not accept co-responsibility with anybody. So everything that is being done completely sneers at the UN, and if the topic is raised, those are, as you said, whether it's by Hegseth or by the White House, those are pathetic niceties in a world of power. We've not really seen this kind of brutality of sentiment, of rhetoric, and of action since 1945. by anybody, by the way, whether it's by the Soviet Union or by the United States in an earlier vintage or by any other country, nothing remotely close to this. I calculate each year with my colleagues an index of UN-aligned multilateralism, which we report annually in a report called the Sustainable Development Report. And even before this war, the United States, far and away, and not even close, Glenn, was the least aligned with the United Nations of all 193 UN member states in terms of engagement with UN processes, including votes in the General Assembly, where the U.S. almost always votes in a tiny minority with Israel and Paraguay and a couple of other countries against the will of the rest of the world, in terms of not signing treaties or leaving treaties. The U.S. is simply rogue or out to destroy the UN. Let's put it that way. And this is all accelerated in recent weeks. What is disturbing, if I could use a light term, because I love to use stronger terms, Europe is completely complicit in this. Europe doesn't show one morsel of support for the UN system, processes, or most importantly, the UN Charter. The core of the UN Charter, the very purpose that you find in the preamble and then in the opening articles, is to stop the use of force and the threat of force by one nation against another nation. This is the essence of the whole UN system. Article 2, paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, which I encourage people to go online and read, says that no nation may threaten force or use force against another nation. It's simple. And as the opening words of the UN Charter make clear, this is to prevent the scourge of war. Well, we have a U.S. president who does believe that the U.S. rules the world and that violence is a core instrument of ruling the world, and that if countries don't accede to U.S. demands, what Trump calls unconditional surrender, with Trump picking the new leader of Iran, well, then force will be continued until that outcome occurs. It's in the mold of Hitler or Napoleon or other delusional actors who thought that they could rule. But even in those earlier cases, they did not believe that they ruled the world. They aimed to rule their neighborhood. They aimed to rule Europe. Hitler aimed for living space in the Slavic lands. Trump's rhetoric and behavior is that he believes that he rules the world. By the way, he believes it at a personalistic level, as well as at a political level. And I'm not exaggerating, and it's not Trump delusion syndrome. It's just the overt behavior. The man's loony, and you can watch it. He's got every trait of megalomania, grandiosity, narcissism, and it's quite clear, by the way, that the U.S. Governmental processes where U.S. foreign policy is typically run by the CIA is a little bit being run ragged right now because they can't keep up with this madness. So there's a lot of unpredictability and a lot of danger in what's happening because we have a mix of U.S. normal grandiosity, which is a deep trait of the United States. It was true during Bush Jr., Obama, and Biden. But with Trump, it adds the usual U.S. institutional grandiosity and militarism with a personal level delusion of leaders. We know this through history. This is not for the first time. It is for the first time, though, in the nuclear age. We've never had a circumstance like this in the nuclear age. And I would say the world is in a more dangerous situation than it has ever been, period.
Well, not only it's becoming more warmongering, though, but we also see, as in many wars, the rule of law weakens. And I want to ask how you see the rule of law and the division of power is being weakened, because again, well, unlike continental Europe, the U.S. has strong traditions on democracy, the division of power, and ask because democracy and freedom doesn't tend to fare well under wars. As we saw during the Cold War, this was not great either for liberalism. And during times of external threats, we see governments often develop very authoritarian tendencies. And we had this now for more than a decade. That is, went from Russiagate to the Ukraine war. We have the economic war with China. None of these things actually stopped, by the way. They just stack on top of each other. And now, of course, the Middle East is set on fire. Under these conditions, one would expect that the rule of law would weaken. Certainly, I see the case here in Europe as well. We had the EU sanctioning its own citizens. We have any dissent or criticism of the government's wars is essentially, well, then you stand with the enemy and you will be punished accordingly. But how do you see it in the United States, though? Because if it's game over there on the rule of law, then it doesn't bode well for Europe.
I think in the United States, foreign policy has been in the hands of the CIA as lead for many decades. And CIA is convenient because it can be completely secret. It is operating through a network of so-called intelligence agencies. These are not intelligence agencies. These are off-the-book militaries. And this has been true for many decades, especially if you are the U.S. government, where the foreign policy is an imperial policy of regime choice and regime change. Trump just says out loud, and in a crazier way, I have to say, what has been U.S. policy. Trump, because he is really what he is psychologically, says that he will pick the next supreme leader of Iran. Okay, this is rather startling. Of course, I have to add, no European leader murmurs a word that this is at all strange, that this is a good way to have a war escalate and continue and on its way to getting us all killed. Not a single European leader scratches her head or his head to say, oh, that's our ally saying the weirdest goddamn things you could possibly imagine. No, they don't say that. But in any event, that mindset you might think is a little odd. But remember, the CIA has always had that mindset. And in 1953, without public scrutiny, without explanation, the U.S. did choose who would lead Iran. They installed the police state that overthrew a democratic government in 1953. And the U.S. backed that police state until 1979, when, lo and behold, the public revolted against it as that police state leader was dying of cancer. That's where the Iranian Revolution came from in the first place in 1979, not out of the blue, but out of a U.S.-imposed police state. Well, you look all over the world, including in Europe, the U.S. imposes governments of choice. And that means that the rule of law in the United States, when it comes to foreign policy, has always been a veneer.
Well, on this issue, though, this is the last question. This insistence of choosing other leaders of other countries and the reluctance to find peaceful solutions with adversaries and primarily other rising powers, be it Russia, China, Iran. To what extent do you think this is linked to the reluctance or the unwillingness to see hegemony go away? Because the Europeans, at least, they very much bought into the whole idea after the Cold War about a world order based on the collective hegemony of the political West, led by the US. But I remember this whole unipolar moment when it was introduced as a concept by Charles Krauthammer back in 1990. He framed it as, this is the distribution of power. All power is in America. But he was making a point as well in this article. Once the world shifts to a more multipolar international distribution of power, then we shift away, as if this would be a rational decision that would be made. But after 35 years of having this political class raised on the ideology that the dominance and perpetual hegemony of the West would essentially be this, democratic peace theory. It would stabilize the world. It would transcend the chaos of the past. So essentially, the hegemony was, essentially humanity's salvation. After you had 35 years of politicians like this, there won't be a peaceful transition to multipolarity. Do you see this as being the reluctance to even accept to have other powers that the West won't dominate anymore? Why there's no alternative to plunging the world into World War III? Because a lot of people criticize Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference, but I don't see. This is essentially the logic I hear from political leaders across Europe as well. Well, not all, but many.
Well, I think this is another case where this is a profound process that has been underway actually for 80 years. The idea of multipolarity was both born and died in 1945 for the following basic reason. The brainchild of the United Nations was also the brainchild of the victory in World War II. And that was Franklin Roosevelt, who understood that he and Stalin and Churchill, and with Franklin Roosevelt's insistence, Chiang Kai-shek, who was head of a struggling and invaded China in the 1940s, invaded by Japan, of course, jointly had to operate to defeat Hitler. This was a collective enterprise. It was an enterprise of the United Nations, a term that was used early in World War II. And Roosevelt believed in that unity, that these nations together had to stick together to defeat Hitler, and then afterwards to make the world safe. But already in the second half of 1945, and that's why the bomb was dropped twice on Japan to impress Mr. Stalin, the U.S. was now at war for global control. The idea of shared responsibilities was already out the window in the American mentality. And this was, of course, put most vividly in NSC Memo 68 in 1950, that this was going to be the U.S. battling world communism for dominance. I say all of this, Glenn, because when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the insanity of a country of 4% of the world population deciding it would run the world went into overdrive. And it went into overdrive, and it's been in overdrive since 1991. The U.S. has viewed itself, and by U.S. I mean the CIA, the military-industrial digital complex, the ones that make the war decisions, that have brought us nonstop into war, that allocate the trillions of dollars and so on. They believe they run the world. When China rose in power over several decades, and that was noticed by the United States sometime around 2010, this freaked out these would-be hegemonists. Now there's an enemy. Russia was dismissed as anyway a has-been, useless, so not really to worry. So we don't have to listen to anything Russia says. But the attention turned to China, and we have to defeat China the same way. That's been the U.S. foreign policy for the last 15 years. Just quickly, a couple flies in the ointment. First, all of this is delusional. That's the first starting point. The idea that the U.S. runs the world, rules the world, dominates the world, can have its way is a madness. It's been a madness for decades. But it's been a repeated madness that leads to millions of deaths all over the world, whether in Vietnam or across wars of the Middle East. Second, the misjudgment about Russia is the reason for the Ukraine war. The U.S. never expected Russia to resist NATO enlargement, never expected to be able to stand up to the United States for one moment. This is both a denigration of Russia and a profoundly delusional exaggeration of American power. Both go hand in hand. But the war in Ukraine is fundamentally the result of an American delusion, spelled out helpfully by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997, because he spelled out in the grand chessboard exactly what the delusion is. And he concluded Russia could not resist the eastward enlargement of NATO and Europe. So that's, and then the other fly in the ointment is Israel. Israel is a crazy rogue state with half its political leadership in the mindset of the 5th century BC. Reading some text from King Josiah, and Israel has just plunged the world into probably the Third World War, but into a phenomenal economic crisis. This is the timing, the instigation is Israel's. The fact that the U.S. goes along with it is because it's completely coherent with the U.S. hegemonic project. But this is Israel. Complete madness. And because of the hold of the Israel lobby in the United States, that madness isn't even examined. Excuse me? We have an ambassador in Israel. The U.S. has an ambassador named Mike Huckabee, who is let's just say a minor Protestant evangelical theologian, if I could put it that way, but that's a very polite way to put it. And he said 2 weeks ago, yes, Israel owns the land from the Nile to the Euphrates. And when Tucker Carlson asked him, excuse me, they own the land, could they take it? He said, sure. Yeah, sure, they could take it. This is, again, what's sometimes called by psychologists or psychiatrists a folie à deux. This is a craziness of Israel matched by a craziness of the United States. The mindset goes back to the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, who said that in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And Hobbes said that to get out of the war of all against all, you need a Leviathan, he called it. You need a superior power. And that was his theory of national government, that people would give up their sovereignty to kill each other, their freedom to kill each other, to a sovereign who would then keep order and everyone would be better off because they wouldn't be killing each other. Then you turn that logic to the global order. And the way that that is turned into the global order by the CIA or by MI6 or by these intelligence agencies in the West is to say, well, we don't have a supreme ruling Leviathan, so it is a war of all against all. And we have to be brutally realistic. It's us or them. And sometimes you have to strike first, like Israel and the United States striking Iran. That's the mindset. But another part of the mindset is the United States says, we'll be the Leviathan, thank you. Britain was the Leviathan in the 19th century. The only way to be safe is if we are the Leviathan. In other words, there can only be one that runs the world and will be the one that runs the world. Now, there is another way in life, which is that you get along with each other. You make some common rules. You share the sandbox. We teach our 5-year-olds to do this. It's not impossible. That you don't need one ruler of the world to have peace. And this is what the American hegemonists or supremacists cannot understand. But I think it's partly they're trapped at an emotional level, maybe before age 5. I don't know. They don't really see that there's another way that in a multipolar world, we actually really could get along. We could make some rules of the road. We could have some cooperation. The one who understood that, as I said, in the United States was Franklin Roosevelt. Another one who understood that more recently was John F. Kennedy. And probably he died because he held that belief, and he was killed from the inside because he held that belief. So this is a tough struggle, and we're in an extraordinarily dangerous moment in the world. If this continues, if Mr. Trump continues to believe that he will pick Iran's next leader and that this is going for unconditional surrender, of course, things will then depend on military outcomes. But one real possibility is an economic crisis globally, instigated by Israel and the United States, the likes of which we've not seen for a long time.
I wish we could have finished on a more optimistic note, but thank you very much for taking the time. I know you have a busy day in Rome there, so try to enjoy it in these perilous times, and yeah, hope to see you soon.
See you soon. Thanks.
播报新闻是我的日常，必须时刻保持妆容和皮肤的最佳状态。当来到人生中最重要的时刻，也是 KS 逆时奇迹帮助我轻松驾驭，闪闪发光。KS 逆时奇迹活肤露全效精华、精华霜，多达5种 EGF 6大冻龄关键成分，保湿效果让我非常满意，小细纹也不再困扰我。我就是我自己的最佳女主角 ，KS 让我从容自信、光彩动人。我是我人生中的大女主，我的最爱我做主。KS 逆时奇迹系列热卖中，下单请上快点购。透过中天新闻网 App 下单立减50%，或输入 CTI 推荐码有额外折扣。